Greetings to you all in the most precious name of our soon coming Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Thank you for taking your time out to tune into this video and to learn the scriptures with me. I thank you all for the support that you have been giving me over the last 1.5 years or so, ever since we started this class or series of study on Mark's Gospel. In this video, we will look at Mark's Gospel, chapter 14, verse 1 to 11. And we will just look at a few verses within that. We find its parallel passages in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 26, verse 6 to 16, in Luke's Gospel, chapter 22, verse 1 to 6, and in John's Gospel, 12, verse 1 to 8. As we harmonize these four Gospels, we have a clearer picture of what happened in Bethany. We have the meal that Jesus had in Bethany along with his disciples and Lazarus and his family, and the betrayal that Judas is planning. The incident of Jesus being at Bethany and having the meal there happens 6 days before the Passover happens, and the betrayal happens 2 days before the Passover. 6 days before the Passover, we see that Jesus was at the house of Simon the leper. Simon might have been cleansed by Jesus, and it is at this home that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus host a meal or a dinner for Jesus and his disciples. As usual, Martha served, and Lazarus was reclining with Jesus and the others at the table. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke doesn't name the woman that brought the alabaster box of ointment or a flask of ointment, whereas John names Mary as that woman. Now, this ointment contained pure nard, and it was very costly. Mary broke the flask, took a part of the ointment made of pure nard, and anointed Jesus' feet, as we read in John 12, and head, and wiped it with her hair. Now, to anoint the feet of a guest or attend to the feet of a guest was a slave's job. And as far as the wiping of the hair was concerned, Jewish women rarely unbound their hair in public. Mary's actions indicate an expression of intense personal devotion to Christ, and there is no moral intent or immoral intent in this gesture that Mary does. Now, regarding the materials that were used in this ointment, the aromatic and pure nard oil is extracted from an Indian or Arabian root. Mary might have had to wait for this material to be imported from India or Arabia, which would take a long time considering the travel time back then. Also, the rarely available commodity makes this product highly priced. It would cost more than 10 months of wages to actually acquire this product. When she anointed Jesus with this ointment, the whole house was filled with fragrance. And why would she do this to Jesus? We have a couple of reasons for this. Number one, we must realize that Jesus was probably the only Jewish rabbi to have women as disciples. No one else allowed women in those times to touch the scriptures. They were not taught the Torah, although they were instructed in accordance to it. Jesus allowed Mary to be a disciple in order to study God's word. During the New Testament times, women were not allowed to testify in courts, and their witness were not considered reliable. No business activities were permitted for women in the first century AD. Respectable women were expected to stay within the confines of their home, and women were not expected to be literate. And it is within all this context that we see Jesus allowing Mary to be a disciple in order to study God's word. And as we look at the Old Testament times, we find that the restrictions given to the women at the time of the New Testament didn't exist in the Old Testament times. We have women who were prophetesses, who were judges, and women were having business activities. They were being taught the Torah and were familiar with the scriptures. So there is no such restrictions on women. So these were a later development that came by the time the first century rolled in. We see Mary in Luke's Gospel 10, verse 41 and 42, where she's sitting at the feet of Jesus to learn the scriptures. Jesus doesn't deny the good part which Mary chose. The other reason for this devotion of Mary was that she was a witness to the resurrection of Lazarus from the dead. She experienced Jesus' claim of being the resurrection and the life. In pouring out the ointment, she portrayed her devotion. The chief priests, as we read in John 12, sought to destroy the risen man, Lazarus, because of their lack of faith. We see here the rights that Jesus gives to women in this passage. And we also see that the one event which leads a devotee to worship is what the hard-hearted mind is stubborn against. And there were some among the crowd who sat within the table who said to themselves indignantly, this was their reaction. The disciples looked at Mary's actions with anger. They were indignant while saying a lot of things to her. They scolded her, and according to them, she did the most despicable thing that they could ever imagine. They thought that her actions were a waste of money. They quickly valued it at 300 or more than 300 denarii and saw it as a waste of money. And publicly, they all say that this money could have been used to help the poor. So it means that they were trying to portray Mary as someone who is insensitive to the poor and unwilling to help the poor. Mary's act of devotion is filled with so much of love towards Jesus, but people look at that with a lot of criticism of varying degrees, perhaps even hinting at doubting her as immoral. She was scolded in public, cornered and spoken against, and she was considered to be inconsiderate to poor. She is also seen as wasting money. So, in the midst of all of these scolding, how does Jesus see her? We see that Jesus speaks up for Mary when others cornered her. Yet again, we see Jesus standing up for women and validating their rights. Jesus says to everyone, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? This exhortation was needed because if Jesus hadn't got up at that time, she would have crumbled in light of the scolding that she received in that room. And look at what Jesus says next. She has done a beautiful thing for me. Others saw this act as a waste of money and exploitation of the poor. But Jesus evaluates this as a beautiful thing that she did for Jesus. What others think of our devotion to God shouldn't matter. What Jesus thinks is what matters. That's the lesson that I would want to give at this point. If the disciples' minds were concerned about the poor, they always had the poor to care for. And then Jesus says to everyone, she has done what she could, considering the fact that Jesus wouldn't be with them always, physically. In the Gospel of Mark, this is the fourth time that Jesus announces his death. Throughout Mark, we see that many times Jesus talked about his upcoming death to the disciples, but they didn't get it or they didn't understand it, nor were they prepared in any way to react with their lives until now. So they were involved in a power struggle on who would be the greatest. But here was Mary doing everything within the purpose of Jesus coming on earth. She believed Jesus' words of his death, unlike the disciples. So her devotion was linked to the messianic works of Jesus. In verse 9, we read that what Mary did, would be preached each time the gospel is presented in the whole world. So we might ask a question: when we share the gospel with someone, do we talk about Mary anointing Jesus with this ointment? No. So what did Jesus mean by saying this in verse 9? That prophecy which Jesus said in verse 9 is fulfilled in the writings of the Gospels, which are biographical accounts of Jesus' life and death along with his resurrection. So, as we discuss this right now on this video, we need to understand that this is a fulfillment of what Jesus said at that time. What the disciples tried to scold Mary for now becomes part of the biblical canon, so that the whole world knows about the act of devotion. A lady who chose to pursue scriptural learning and willingly makes a sacrifice, a self-sacrificing act of devotion, is honored by Jesus with a far-reaching honor. So let's look at a few lessons and applications from Mary's life at this point. Number one, what are our devotions, or what are our reasons to show devotions to Christ? What are our reasons to show devotion to Christ? The fact that He came to give us a chance to know God in a personal relationship. The fact that He came to offer us God's kingdom at the cost of His life. The fact that He is the Lord of both life and death. The fact that He gave men and women equality in the essential things pertaining to salvation and scriptures. The fact that we have experienced forgiveness and redemption through Jesus. The fact that we are justified. These are things that should drive us to show acts of devotion to Jesus. Number two, what do we learn from the example of Mary? There are two things in here. Number one, her devotion was a costly affair. Her willingness to spend on such an expensive ointment showed her honor that she had for Jesus. True devotion from our hearts towards God isn't cheap. It demands everything we have, even our very lives. Second, the fact that more than 300 denarii was the cost suggested that these people were not rich to afford this. It was months and months of savings after all expenses had been met. This shows how deliberate she was in saving money to honor Jesus. This was a priority. It was not an afterthought. Now, the third thing from Mary's life, or Mary's example here, is this. Her devotion was closely tied, intrinsically tied to the messianic work of Jesus. Every devotion, if it is not based on what the Messiah had come to accomplish, is not received or accepted by Jesus. Lots of people light candles or pray to Jesus just because He blessed them financially or materially or delivered them from some mishap. But the ultimate identity which matters to us is that Jesus is the Messiah. So any devotion or act of devotion that you do, if it does not have the cross in it, if it does not have the death and the resurrection of Jesus included in that, your acts of devotion are a waste. Let's get that straight. Second, or the next point from Mary's life is this. The way she stood and poured out the ointment and wiped Jesus' feet with her hair showed devotion in a very humble manner. She was willing to look at herself as a slave. Only slaves used to wash the feet of guests. This is how we should come expressing our devotion. We look at the glorious Christ and His worth, and you and I will realize that we don't have the worth to stand before Jesus. We are there because of grace. And that is what makes us humble. Just like Mary received grace in studying scriptures and witnessing Lazarus from the dead. The third thing in the lessons and application section is this: in what manner does Jesus regard our devotion? Number one, he looks at our devotion with such compassion and receives our sincere devotion. He doesn't devalue it as the world does. The world may misrepresent us, malign us with false accusations, as we do honor and devotion to Jesus. It may represent us as something we are not. We need to realize that what others wrongly think of us is not going to matter. What God thinks about us will matter. The world may think of our best efforts as a waste, using money for Jesus is a waste, and all that. But in the hindsight, God values devotion more than anything else. Number two, Jesus sees the intention behind every act of devotion and rewards accordingly. Number three, no matter how small or big our act of devotion is to God, when the act pleases God because it comes from a pure heart, a clear heart, God calls it beautiful. Number four, the fourth point in the lessons and application section is this: it is God's choice on whether to make a specific act known to the world. It is not necessary that all acts of devotion receive public attention. Number five, the very same people who scolded Mary end up saying the story and associate it with the gospel message that they are writing about. For example, in that room, you have Matthew and you have John who were scolding Mary, and Jesus said these things in such a way that eventually all four gospel writers write about this lady in this. Well, that's what happens when Jesus vindicates those who have been wronged for him. Well, what happens after this, we will look at it in the next section. May God's name be glorified.